All right, well, welcome to the fourth and final REAL session. We're here today in advance of the publication of the REAL rule proposal, which took 4 years and lots of engagement to bring us to this point. I'm Katie Angarone, Assistant Commissioner for Watershed and Land Management here at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And I want to once again thank all of you who provided constructive feedback over those 4 years. But in truth, the stormwater amendments that we will discuss today, they really harken back to a stormwater stakeholder process that predates the REAL rulemaking process. These amendments come in part from a broad-based group of individuals who brought us the green infrastructure as rules as phase 1. And these amendments, which are critical to resilience and water quality across the state, and which are considered phase 2, they come from the recommendations that came out of that effort. And I would be remiss if I did not mention one of the great stakeholders in this space that we lost in April of 2023, Tony DiLudovico. Tony was bright and dedicated, and New Jersey's stormwater program is better for his participation. So I just wanted to mention that. Today, we're going to hear from Vince Mazzei, the State Floodplain Administrator, as well as Gabriel Mann, who is our Bureau Manager and General Stormwater Expert, about the amendments in the REAL rule proposal that pertain to stormwater management. And I'm sure that everyone here has noticed that our rainfall patterns in New Jersey and really across the region are changing. And hopefully you're also aware that New Jersey led the nation by updating the critical rainfall data that we use to design our projects. We worked with the Northeast Regional Climate Center to update the NOAA rainfall data that had not been updated in 20 years. We analyzed that data and validated what we had suspected, that we have been experiencing more extreme rainfall events. We then went a step further and, using the best available science, projected out increases in extreme rainfall going forward. And we did this because, as I noted in the first REAL webinar, the stability assumption, the idea that the weather is going to behave as it always has, is no more. And the water resource engineers out there will realize that this is just another way of saying what Milley et al. Wrote in the journal Science in 2008, that stationarity is dead and cannot be revived. We based the inland flood protection rules on that new rainfall study, including amendments to the stormwater rules. Now, much of the state was already developed before DEP adopted statewide standalone stormwater rules 20 years ago this February. Before then, stormwater management was done primarily by the municipalities, and to a great extent, that's still true. But a lot has changed in 20 years. First, we know and have documented that extreme rainfall events are increasing in frequency. Cloudburst events are happening and overwhelming our stormwater systems as rain runs off of unmanaged or undermanaged impervious areas. Second, in our commitment to environmental justice, we have acknowledged that environmental protection isn't for the lucky few. It is deserved and it is expected for all of our communities. For many communities that were developed before there were any stormwater management rules at all, or where infrastructure is no longer adequate, we must do better. Merely holding the line in areas with degraded waters or that suffer from stormwater flooding isn't enough. During the stormwater stakeholdering, I heard more than once and from various folks that water quality and flood improvements cannot be balanced on the back of new development alone. And they were right. We will not get there if we don't start to look at redevelopment. So in watershed and land management, we have determined to recommit to restoration through these rules in this proposal, but also through our data analysis, our grant making, and with our planning and tool development. And we're doing that on multiple fronts. And we're committed to helping communities restore their water resources while preparing for climate impacts. So with that said, I'm going to hand it to Vince to walk us through these important amendments and really show how we're honoring that commitment to restoration and environmental justice. Vince?
Thank you, Katie. Very well said. All right, let's see. Let me
Where'd you go, Vince?
All right. I don't know, but I'm back.
Okay.
Sorry about that. All right. Technology is great when it works. Not so great when it doesn't work. All right. Give me 1 second to get the PowerPoint up. All right. Share. All right. Please tell me you can see that.
We can. I can.
Okay.
Hopefully everyone else can too.
All right. Very good. All right. Well, first of all, thank you for the 300 and plus people that are here that you've taken your time to listen to this. You know, we hope that this is a dialogue and not just us explaining to you what the rules are proposing to do, but is a dialogue about how that works and some scenarios and things like that. So I encourage you to ask questions. Other PowerPoints that we've done have had a lot of graphics in them. This one doesn't have so many graphics because it's mostly focusing on the words of what the stormwater rules do. And with that, let me step back a moment. As you know, a quick overview. This rulemaking was developed in response to Governor Murphy's 2020 executive order. We've had dozens of stakeholder sessions with many groups since that time. And the proposal focuses on the four land use rules that we manage under WLM: flood hazard, stormwater, coastal zone management, and wetlands. But it also opens up other DEP rules that reference flooding, which is most of the DEP rules. So this is one of the larger rulemakings that we've done because it opens up so many rules. And the main purpose is to address impacts of sea level rise, which we covered largely in the first webinar, and also to improve land and water resource protection, which we covered partly in the second and third, and now fourth with this today's webinar. The schedule that we anticipate, going back to earlier this month on May 2nd, we filed the proposal with the Office of Administrative Law, and we posted a courtesy copy of what we filed on our DEP website. And it's currently under review by the Office of Administrative Law, where this is the fourth of four webinar sessions that hopefully you've attended. If not, you can go to our website and you can download copies of the PowerPoint and you can access a recording of each of the webinars. We anticipate that the publication of this proposal will be in July, after which we'll have 3 public hearings and a 90-day comment period. So effectively, you figure since the courtesy copy was released in May and it's not published until July, there's 2 months before publication and 3 months after publication. So 5 months of being able to review this rulemaking, which is appropriate because of the size and the complexity of it, and also because of, we want folks to understand it and be able to respond to it with, detailed and helpful questions and comments. And so our anticipated adoption then would be sometime mid next year. We have 1 year from when it was filed with OAL. I'm sorry, we have 1 year from when it was published, when it will be published by OAL. So if it's published, say, July 1st, then that means we have until July 1st of 2025 to file the adoption document, and then it would be adopted shortly after that. So a couple things I like to remind folks of is that the scope of the rulemaking is for new development, redevelopment, and substantial improvements to buildings. It does not apply to existing development. It doesn't create no build zones, and it doesn't require roads and buildings to be elevated when doing so is impracticable. So the idea is that if an improvement is being made, whether it's a minor or a major improvement to a property, if there's an opportunity to add some value and increase the sustainability and safety of the structure, to reduce runoff volume, to improve water quality, then the rules in whole take that view and try to make things better where we can. But we recognize that there's areas where you can add value, and we'll talk about that today. As I've mentioned before, we have 7 main themes: protecting against chronic inundation, sea level rise, and flood damage, protect critical facilities and infrastructure. Those 2 were covered under the first webinar. The second webinar covered protecting land and water resources. Today, we'll talk about improving stormwater management, and encouraging nature-based solutions, supporting renewable energy was covered on webinar number 3 on the coastal zone management rules. So as Katie mentioned, over the last 50 years, we have had a great increase in the intensity of extreme rainfalls that we've had in the state. There's been according to one study, there's been a 71% increase in these storms which is a faster increase than anywhere else in the country. And we covered a lot of the impacts of that under our inland flood protection rule by requiring that designs be made with the year 2100 rainfall in mind, as well as today's rainfall. But a lot of our rules, and I've mentioned this before, but our rules are focused on trying to make sure that a project, whatever it is, doesn't make things worse, doesn't make flooding worse, doesn't impair water quality. But we could adopt regulations that say no project would ever have any stormwater runoff at all. Let's say we just had a rule that said no more development. We still would have existing water quality issues and existing flood issues throughout the state because of our historic development. So keeping the status quo of making sure that development just equals what today's conditions are doesn't work with a changing climate. And stormwater designs that maintain existing runoff amounts and water quality conditions won't be effective in the long term. So the proposal focuses on ways to improve conditions where practicable, such as by decreasing stormwater volume, improving pollutant removal and stormwater, and other things. And that will all have an effect on our combined sewer overflow incidents because, as you know, we have a lot of CSO communities, and when we have stormwater events that overwhelm the system, then we have discharges of raw sewage into our waterways, which is obviously something that we greatly want to avoid. So I am going to, in the next about 30 slides, walk through in order pretty much most of the proposal details. There's some things that we've left out for, just for being able to focus on the things that will be of interest to everyone. So you can obviously read through it and compare this with the rulemaking, but this covers the majority of the changes that are being made. And so hopefully we'll provide an opportunity for folks to ask questions and talk about the implications of it. So let's start with definitions. The first thing that we propose to do is amend the definition of disturbance to clarify that certain maintenance and repair activities are not subject to these rules. So the question has come up over and over again, well, what if we're just milling and repaving or patching broken pavement or repairing sidewalks or median barriers or curbs, inlets, or guide rails, or repairing or replacing traffic poles and overhead signage and things like that? Or if we're doing geotechnical or archaeological investigations, do these trigger stormwater management? How about installation of monitoring wells or placement of gauge weirs or similar devices, or removal of accumulated sediment or debris? Find that in the rulemaking that these types of activities, and you can look in the definition itself to see a more detailed explanation, but that these activities would not constitute disturbance. And if it doesn't constitute disturbance, then it wouldn't be counted towards a major development. And speaking of major development, we're amending the definition of major development to ensure consistency between development subject to DEP review and development subject to local review under municipal stormwater control ordinances. So this would eliminate a gap in the level of protection for water quality and flood prevention between state and municipal project reviews. Gabe, do you have any ideas of what that might look like, or examples of how that's played out in the past that you want to share with anyone?
Well, I think the main way that it occurs is that municipalities right now are only required to have the 1 acre of disturbance as their threshold of major development. Now, many have just adopted ours anyway, but for the few that have just left themselves with only the 1 acre of disturbance and not the 1/4 acre of regulated motor vehicle surface or impervious surface, they'll be forced now to change their ordinance to include that as part of the definition of major development.
Great, thank you.
And the same would hold true for the DOT, because right now they have a separate MS4 permit and theirs is just tied to the 1 acre of disturbance, and other highway agencies and the public complexes as well. So they'll all be forced to look at our definition of major development.
Right. So basically after adoption, then everyone looking at stormwater management would look at these rules and use the same threshold for triggering compliance with the rules.
Well, for municipalities, they have to adopt an ordinance first. So they'll have a year to adopt an ordinance from when this goes out. But for the counties, like the highway agencies, the public complexes, yeah, they look straight to the rules. So this would become implemented immediately for them.
Right. Good. Thank you. All right. Another thing that we're proposing to amend in the definition of major development is to include the reconstruction of 1/4 acre or more of regulated motor vehicle surface or regulated impervious surface. So I'll explain what this looks like. Here's the actual definition in the rules, and the white text is existing and the proposed new text is in orange. So major development means today a handful of things. It means an individual development, which is defined, as well as multiple developments that individually or cumulatively result in: one, disturbance of 1 or more acres of land since the adoption of the 2004 stormwater rules on February 2nd. 2, the creation of a 1/4 acre or more of regulated impervious surface since that same date. 3, the creation of 1/4 acre or more of regulated motor vehicle surface since those rules were amended to include that term on March 2nd, 2021. And then this proposal would add this: the reconstruction of 1/4 acre or more of regulated motor vehicle surface or regulated impervious surface since the effective date of this rule. So it would look to any kind of cumulative impacts or cumulative amounts after the date of this rule. And of course, any combination of 1, 2, 3, and 4 above that totals an area of 1/4 acre or more. The same surface shall not be counted twice when determining if combination areas equal 1/4 acre or more. So what this does is it closes some of the gaps that we have in our water quality protection. And I'd like to focus on this for a moment. So as you know, as this slide shows, that if you are increasing your impervious surface or your regulated motor vehicle surface by 1/4 acre, then you trigger our water quality component of the rules. But you could be reconstructing large areas of motor vehicle surface or impervious surface and not trigger the rules, or not trigger the water quality component, because you're not increasing it. So we've seen time and time again where we've had acres and acres of redevelopment activities where existing impervious surface was being removed and replaced. And because the total amount of impervious surface is not greater than existing conditions, the water quality standards in section 5.5 would not kick in. Now, so that's a missed opportunity in our estimation, because the previous development that's being removed didn't have water quality treatment. And so this is an opportunity to provide that water quality treatment for redevelopment activities. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in section 5.5. The next thing is to provide a definition of public roadway or railroad project limits. And this is necessary to clarify the categories of projects that will be given flexibility under the existing waiver for public transportation entities at 5.2E and some of the green infrastructure standards in section 5.3, which we'll talk about. And next is definition of reconstruction. And it might seem odd that I'm focusing a lot on the definitions, but everything that we do hangs on these definitions. And that's why it's in the front part of the first part of the rule, really, right after the scope and purpose. So that way, when we talk about reconstruction throughout the rules, everyone knows what it means. It's almost like an index that you can go back to and see what we mean when we say certain terms. So we don't currently have a definition of reconstruction, and so we want to clarify the modifications to existing structures that will constitute a major development and ones that won't. So as proposed, reconstruction means the replacement, rebuilding, or restoration of a lawfully existing structure. So if you contrast that with the proposed definition of disturbance, the proposed amended definition, where we talk about things that don't count towards reconstruction, or any disturbance would be things like milling and repaving and all those other minor activities that we talked about. And the reason why is because if you're just milling and repaving a road, there's no opportunity to provide water quality improvement. There's no opportunity. You're not adding inlets. You're just maintaining the structure. If you're repairing a guide rail or a median, you're just maintaining what's there and you're not changing the conditions, and there's no opportunity to make things better. But if you're reconstructing the way we've defined it, then there is an opportunity, we believe, in most cases, to provide some value. And so the rule focuses on that. There's also a definition proposed for retention, and that comes up with our volumetric reduction standards that we'll talk about in section 5.6 later on today. But the definition would address activities that retain stormwater runoff for those standards, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, the applicability to major development, section 1.6, this is where our legacy provisions are. And we've clarified that two things. One is that if a permit application that's subject to the stormwater rules, a major development. If you're applying to DEP or to a local review agency like a municipality, the standards that are in place the day that the complete application is submitted would govern, right? So whatever rules are in effect the day a complete application is submitted to the review agency or DEP, those are the rules that we would use to review the project. So in other words, if we adopt this rule on July 1st, 2025, and you submit an application on June 30th, 2025, the day before the rule takes effect, then these proposed new standards would not apply to that project, as long as it was a complete for a complete application. So that means it's a technically and administratively complete application. For railroad and roadway projects under the oversight of a public transportation entity, in those cases, when that project received or achieved a preferred alternative or an equivalent milestone in its design, then when that date occurs, whatever rules are in effect at that date are what would govern the review of the project from a stormwater management component. Section 3.4, characterization and assessment of the regional stormwater management planning area, and Section 4.2, municipal stormwater management plan and elements. Both are being amended to require climate resilience planning in stormwater management plans and regional stormwater management plans. So a municipality or regional planning agency would be required to evaluate climate change impacts on the stormwater management systems, including but not limited to sea level rise, increased flooding frequency and extent, increased rainfall and intensity. And the municipality would be required to identify areas and stormwater management infrastructure that's vulnerable to flooding and or sea level rise, as well as measures such as green infrastructure that can be used to mitigate these impacts. So these are all new requirements for a plan that would have to be addressed. Section 5.2 of the rules is stormwater management measures for major developments. So this kind of sets the stage for the rest of subchapter 5. And in 5.2D, there are some activities that are exempted from the requirements of 5.4 through 5.6, which is the recharge requirements, the stormwater quality, and the stormwater quantity requirements. So I'm going to show you the proposed text. The existing text is in white and the proposed text is in orange. So the following development projects are exempt from those standards that I mentioned, provided that any vegetated area is temporarily disturbed to conduct the maximum extent practicable, revegetated with native non-invasive vegetation upon completion. So the first one is so you can see where the white letters are what's there now. So today it just says the construction of an underground utility line, but we're qualifying that a bit and expanding it to say the construction, reconstruction, or repair of an underground utility line or cable or its supporting infrastructure such as conduit, junction boxes, and manholes. Similarly, for above ground utility lines, we're saying that the construction, reconstruction, repair of those lines or cables and its supporting infrastructure such as poles and towers does not trigger the stormwater management rules. The construction, reconstruction, and repair of a public pedestrian access, such as a sidewalk or trail with a maximum width of 14 feet, provided that it's made of permeable material. This is you can see the white is the existing rules, and we're just adding reconstruction or repair to clarify that that would be covered. A new category that we're adding is dam maintenance activities. We want to do everything we can to facilitate the maintenance, repair, and operation of dams. And so if there's an activity that's necessary under the Safe Dam Act rules to maintain a dam, then that would be not subject to the stormwater management rules. And then this is a fifth category that focuses on public safety improvements that are undertaken by public transportation entities. Now, public transportation entity, we adopted that definition in the Inland Flood Protection Rule. And a public transportation entity basically means any government agency that would be proposing a public roadway or a railroad. So this is not just DOT and the Turnpike and the South Jersey Transportation or New Jersey Transit, but it's also municipalities and counties that are proposing roadway activities. So all of the standards, whenever there's a public transportation entity mentioned, would apply across the board to all those entities. So if you're installing guide rail systems or putting impact attenuators or non-vegetated treatment services, provided that all of the pavement utilized consists solely of permeable material. That is not something that's subject to section 5.5 through 5.4 through 5.6. Second, installation of traffic utility, IT structures. Some of this stuff is already covered under the previous definition that we talked about, but it's making very clear that if you have a composite project where these things are included in along with other things, that these components would not contribute to stormwater and therefore would not need to be evaluated for under these rules. So structures on poles like signs, dynamic variable messaging signs, cameras, radios, things like that. Installation of railroad line side signaling systems, rockfall mitigation activities that do not result in a net increase of regulated motor vehicle surface or impervious surface. So these things would, under section 5.2D, would not be subject to section 5.4, 5, or 6. Another proposed amendment to section 5.2 is at 5.2I, and to facilitate the use of small scale green infrastructure BMPs, the proposal eliminates the minimum orifice size, which is now 2.5 inches, from the intake to an outlet of a stormwater basin, as long as the design of the flow control device and in the outlet is proven to prevent clogging and remain functional. So we're removing that limitation on the size, but you have to demonstrate that it's not going to clog and it's going to remain functional throughout the storm. Then moving to the green infrastructure standards, we have a number of standards in 5.3 F through K that will be added to provide public transportation entities flexibility to manage stormwater runoff by using green infrastructure. And what it does in F through K is that it provides a hierarchical approach that ensures that green infrastructure BMPs are utilized to the maximum extent practicable. And the demonstration or the test as to whether or not something is practicable considers the hydrologic and hydraulic conditions of the lands and immediately adjacent to the project limits and in the upstream drainage limits. So there's a lot of flexibility built in there, but the idea is that where something can be used, it should be used. Where it's impracticable to use a particular type of infrastructure, green infrastructure, then there's flexibility built in so that the goals of the rule can be achieved and also balance the needs of the transportation entities. In section 5.5, under the stormwater runoff quality standards, as I mentioned earlier, we are proposing to require water quality treatment for redeveloped motor vehicle surface, even if there is not a net increase of a 1/4 acre. So, as I mentioned, there's currently no water quality treatment unless impervious surface or motor vehicle surface is increased by a 1/4 acre. And we believe that's a large missed opportunity to improve water quality and to undo the impairments that have been caused by historic development. So this is of particular importance given our commitment to environmental justice in the state, because many overburdened communities have developed along with motor vehicle surfaces and have experienced degraded water quality as a result. And so this is an opportunity now for us to improve the water quality in these areas that have been impacted by historic development. Next, we're clarifying the applicability of the 95% TSS removal rate requirement. So in section 5.5, it talks about when you need to achieve that 95% TSS removal rate. And it really focuses on discharges into a 300-foot riparian zone. But there are scenarios that can come along that we've encountered that we want to address in these regulations, and I'll show you with some diagrams. So the idea is that we want to ensure that the 95% TSS removal requirement rate, which is necessary because of Category 1 waters, which have our 300-foot riparian zones, which is necessary to ensure the continued quality of those waters, that runoff into the 300-foot riparian zone receives a higher level of water quality treatment, because that 300-foot riparian zone is a type of BMP. And water flowing through it will receive a certain amount of water quality treatment. So water that's discharged 301 feet away from a stream, the water will go through that water. Now, I granted there could be some issues with offsite stability and whatnot, and we addressed that in some prior rulemakings where larger storms can be brought directly to the stream if the water quality storm is discharged outside the 300-foot riparian zone. But there are some cases where you might have existing development that interferes with the discharge or kind of confuses the scenario. So here's some examples. Here's a Category 1 water with a 300-foot riparian zone, and that means 300 feet on both sides of the water. And you can see a roadway passing through it. So let's say that there's an existing storm sewer system that discharges into the Category 1 water, discharges within that 300-foot riparian zone. It could have been built years ago, could be from some other development. It could be just from the roadway drainage itself. It could be that there's inlets, along the roadway that just discharge at the bridge. It's a pretty common occurrence. So let's say that you were proposing this development and you had your stormwater BMP, and your stormwater BMP tied directly into this existing storm sewer that discharged into the 300-foot riparian zone. So even though the point of connection is outside the 300-foot riparian zone, the project would still require removal of 95% TSS rate because it ties into a line that basically circumvents and short circuits the riparian zone. So this would be equivalent, tying into this line would be equivalent to a direct discharge into the waterway. And so something like this would require a 95% TSS removal rate. Similarly, if irrespective of whether the drainage system along the roadway, let's say this stormwater BMP discharged within that 300-foot riparian zone. Now I show it down to the edge of the water because that's generally where it would be, but anywhere in that 300-foot riparian zone, if there was a discharge, you would also trigger that 95% TSS removal rate, which is currently the case. And let's say that same project discharges outside the 300-foot riparian zone. And most of the time that we see that, it's just the water quality design storm, and the existing rules talk about that. Both the flood hazard rules and stormwater rules, they point to each other and talk about the scenarios where the water quality treatment that's being provided through the 300-foot riparian zone applies to the water quality design storm and not the larger storms. So they can be brought down to the stream if off-site stability is an issue. So in this case, because the discharge is outside the 300-foot riparian zone, the project would require 80% TSS removal rate because that's the default standard, and it doesn't discharge directly into C1 water or the 300-foot riparian zone. So here's the actual language in the rule. 95% TSS removal of the anticipated load expressed as an annual average shall be achieved for stormwater runoff from any new or reconstructed motor vehicle surface that is proposed to be 1, discharged within a 300-foot riparian zone as established under the flood hazard rules, or discharged into an existing or proposed stormwater conveyance system that ultimately discharges within a 300-foot riparian zone located within the same HUC 14. You could have situations where you have human-made features that go for miles and miles, and it might go into another HUC 14. It's not a C1 water in that situation, and we're not talking about those scenarios. We're talking about situations where the runoff is getting directly into the 300-foot riparian zone within the same HUC 14. Another proposal in the water quality standards, and you can see that I put the citations at the top so that you can look at the rules and look at the context of these changes. But this proposal, this amendment focuses on providing public transportation entities some flexibility when achieving 80% TSS removal is not practicable. Now, under 5.2E today, in the existing rules, there is some flexibility for public transportation entities that can't achieve full compliance with stormwater management rules. And this is clarifying in the water quality section what that means specifically for TSS removal rates. So if achieving 80% TSS removal is not practicable, if the public transportation entity demonstrates it, especially if the public transportation entity demonstrates that it will require an acquisition of developed or otherwise encumbered land outside the right-of-way along the section of roadway being improved or constructed, the public transportation entity shall instead provide water quality treatment to the maximum extent practicable. So the idea is that if achieving 80% would mean acquiring extra land outside the right-of-way and that wasn't already being acquired for some other reason, then the rule says do the best you can to get as close to 80%, but not less than 50. 50 is the bottom limit for this, which is similar to the TSS removal rate that we have used since 2004 for reconstructed of 50%. So this sets the goal to be 80, but allows flexibility down to 50% TSS removal if those circumstances are met. Another thing in the stormwater runoff quality standards, incorporating additional measures from our NJPACT rules into the design and performance standards. So for example, let's say that a municipality is located in a watershed that has TMDLs. The proposal would require that those major developments incorporate whatever additional measures are necessary to meet those TMDLs. Now, TMDLs, if you're not familiar with that, total maximum daily load, that represents a simulative or carrying capacity of a water body. So an analysis is done taking into consideration point and non-point sources of pollution, as well as natural background levels of pollution and surface water withdrawals. So effectively, a TMDL quantifies the amount of a pollutant that a water body can accommodate without violating water quality standards. And it also allocates that loading capacity to known point sources in the form of waste load allocations and to non-point sources in the form of load allocations, and includes a margin of safety and optional considerations for reserve capacity. Gabe, is there anything that you want to expound on what this says, like give examples or talk about how this has come up in the past?
Well, the additional measures is a requirement in the MS4 part of the NJPACT rules. So we impose that on MS4s. And right now, if we were to do that with the current structure of the rules, the town would be required to implement that through their MS4 permit. But at the state level, we technically wouldn't have anything directing us to implement that in the stormwater management rules. So I don't think this is a situation that right now is going to directly get implemented. But if there is a TMDL that has additional measures that we have to put on the MS4, this makes sure that both at the state level and the local level, it'll be implemented instead of just being at the local level.
Excellent, thank you. All right, just a few more slides and then we'll have ample time for questions, and I can always go back and pull up a slide if you want to talk about something that we've covered. So under section 5.6, our stormwater runoff quantity standards, in cases where an applicant seeks to match peak runoff rates from current conditions under 5.6b, that's one of the options, is to match the current runoff rates. The proposal clarifies that the hydrologic and hydraulic analysis of downstream flooding is not required if the change in time for the time of concentration is solely a result of the proposed installation of BMPs to meet the stormwater quality standards or the volumetric reduction standards, which we'll talk about shortly. Matter of fact, we're talking about it right now, requiring reduction of runoff volumes under 5.6D. This is a proposed new standard. So if you recall, we've said a few times in our seminars and throughout the rules that we are looking for ways that when development is occurring or redevelopment activities are occurring, that we can help to undo some of the flooding impacts and water quality impacts that have occurred in the state due to previous development. And so if a major development is being proposed, there's a new requirement to reduce the runoff volume of a portion of that volume, especially in more frequent smaller storm events, and to make sure that they're not discharged off-site. So in other words, taking some water out of the mix, trapping a certain amount of water and infiltrating it. And that water is the amount of water, which we'll talk about, is the water quality design storm. So this will help reduce local and regional flooding. And there's, of course, flexibility that if the volumetric reduction of runoff on site is demonstrated to be technically impracticable, then you can instead remove impervious surface from the same HUC 14. So that's a kind of a simplification of it, but let me show you the actual options. So the first option is retention of the water quality design storm using green infrastructure BMPs. Now, if retention is not practicable, if it's technically impracticable, or the runoff should not be recharged because it's from a high pollutant source, or there's other reasons, then you can alternately reduce the peak flow rate for the water quality design storm to less than the peak flow rate from an area equivalent to the size of the disturbed area, assuming undeveloped conditions, so wooded hydrologic soil group D conditions. So in other words, if you can't, under this option, if you can show that it's technically impracticable or unwise to infiltrate, to trap and infiltrate the water quality design storm, you can instead reduce the peak flow rate to less than that peak flow rate. And you also have to show that the runoff hydrograph duration for the water quality design storm is greater than the runoff hydrograph duration of the storm from an area equivalent in size to the disturbed area, assuming undeveloped conditions. So the idea is that you're making the discharge from the water quality design storm equal to or less than peak flow rates and over a longer period of time. So that's option one. Option two, and you can do a combination of 1 and 2 if you want, is option 2 is to do one or both of the following. You can remove existing impervious surface equal to or exceeding the impervious surface within the developed portions of the major development site. So if you're placing a half an acre of pavement and you can rip up half an acre of pavement somewhere else, then you meet the standard. Or you can retain an equivalent or greater volume of stormwater runoff generated by the water quality design storm at an offsite location. So instead of doing it at your site, you could trap the amount of runoff that would occur from that water quality design storm and treat it and provide infiltration and rate reductions there. Now, it has to be in the same HUC 14 unless the applicant's a public transportation entity and they demonstrate that it's technically impracticable to do it within the HUC 14. But that's going to be pretty rare in most cases. And so most of these projects obviously are going to be on site or nearby. Just a couple more slides and then we'll get into questions. There is a new variance from the design and performance standards for stormwater management measures that's being proposed at section 5.10. It's a new provision that would apply when on-site stormwater management is technically impracticable. So this could be utilized by anyone, provided that the municipalities adopted a stormwater mitigation plan. And so this is something that occurs under MS4 permits when it doesn't come to the department. And so the department is saying, when you come to DEP for a permit, we want to apply the same flexibility that you would have if you didn't need a DEP permit. And so this looks to those local stormwater mitigation plans. An exception is made for state projects because no municipal approval is required on those things. So you wouldn't have a stormwater mitigation plan on a local level that would apply to a state project. So state projects would have to provide some kind of mitigation plan on their own to demonstrate that when on-site treatment of stormwater is technically impracticable, that it can be done at an off-site area to an equal amount. And that includes quality, quantity, recharge, all the standards of the rules. And finally, last slide before the question and answer session. We covered this earlier in webinar number 2 about our improvements to protections of land and water resources, but I think it's worth repeating here that under the stormwater rules, we have an interesting circumstance where if you need an individual wetlands permit and your project is a major development, then we look at stormwater management under the stormwater management rules. So when you apply for that individual permit and it's for a major development, even if the major development is not all in the wetlands, we would look at stormwater at DEP as part of the permit review. But under a general permit or special activity waivers, the language in the wetlands rules focuses on the activity itself. So the major development has to be in the wetlands and transition area to trigger a GP or the stormwater review under a GP or special activity waiver. So this is a kind of a gap, and it shows that, and it's different than our flood hazard rules and our coastal zone management rules. So if you need a flood hazard permit or CZM permit, and you have a major development, let's say it's a flood hazard permit and it's a 10-acre subdivision, it's a major development, and the only disturbance within the floodplain or riparian zone is the discharge. So in the floodplain, in the riparian zone, is a very small amount of disturbance. We would still look at stormwater management from that runoff because it's being conveyed through an area that we regulate. And we have a responsibility to ensure that water quality and flooding, water quality is met and maintained, and flooding is not exacerbated. But you could have that same project, say, under a wetlands permit, a GP10, where you have a road crossing, and you might have a very small amount of wetlands disturbance actually associated with the project, or small amount of transition area disturbance. So the actual amount in transition areas and wetlands might be well less than an acre or a quarter acre of impervious surface or motor vehicle surface. Today, we wouldn't require stormwater management review. This would change that so that the flood hazard rules, the coastal rules, and the wetlands rules would all be the same. So that brings us to the end. And I'm sure that there are many questions.
All right, Vince, I think we should start with the questions that are in the chat, and I'm just going to invite people to ask them themselves. So Anthony Donatiello.
Hi, it's me. My question is kind of regarding milling and repaving and reconstruction. So when is there a definition for like when it's considered reconstruction instead of resurfacing or repaving?
Yeah, there's a distinction made in the rule. You mean as far as like how far down you could excavate before it becomes reconstruction? Gabe, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I don't know if there's like an exact depth of reconstruction, but it's when you go down into the sub base of the roadway or parking lot that we're going to start looking at as reconstruction instead of just, resurfacing the top layer of asphalt.
All right, thanks. The next question is from an unknown user, so maybe you could introduce yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
So just want to confirm on the grandfathering or the exemption on these new rules, because first you stated that the application had to be received before the effective date of the rules, but then I think I heard it right. The application has to be technically complete. Is that right?
The application has to be, so in order to be legacy under the whatever, the current rules, let's say, right? So let's say that this is adopted July 1st next year and you submit an application on June 30th. So as long as that application that you submitted on June 30th is a technically complete application, so in other words, it includes all the components to it, even though we might determine after July 1st that it's technically complete, right? Because it's going to take us some time to actually review it and make that determination. Since it showed up in our office on June 30th, as a complete application, you're legacied from it. But let's say that it
you
comes
really
in.
you mean administratively complete, as long as a complete application is submitted, because usually you don't get technically complete under CAFR rules, for example. I mean, there's 20 working days for an application to be considered technically complete. So it would have to be submitted prior to the effective date and deemed technically complete. The way it works now with grandfathering, and I say grandfathering, you say legacy, but I think they're the same thing.
Right. We use the term legacy instead of grandfathering now because grandfathering has some very bad history to it. So we're trying to use that terminology now. So that's an interesting circumstance with the coastal rules. So it does say technically complete, right? And generally, you're not going to have something that's technically complete without administrative completeness. I guess you could have that. Like, I guess you could have a technically complete application, but not have paid the fee. But you're talking about for CAFRs specifically, that the technical completeness determination comes later on in the process.
I think it's actually the opposite. You could have an administratively complete application the day you submit it. You did all your certified mails, you submitted the check, everything, but it's not technically complete until the DEP review officer looks at it in those first 20 working days and deems it technically complete.
Well, let's say that happens. So it comes in on June 30th in my example, and on July 15th, we make that determination, right? Within the 20 working days, 20 working days. After that, it still would be legacy because the idea is that it showed up in our office as a complete application. We might not have determined that it showed up as a complete application for a few weeks, but it was here. In other words, as long as it gets in the door, so that when we eventually look at it, we say, oh, this is a complete application, then you'd be fine. So
In
I
other
think
words, it did not need to be supplemented in any way, shape, or form. It was not deficient when it was sent in.
Not technically deficient.
Not deficient in any way is what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think y'all need to look at that, because it in the past, it's always been technically complete, and CAFR applications are not technically complete the date they're received. I mean, they could later be deemed technically complete, but
I think that's what, I think we're saying the same thing. I think we're sort of missing each other. I think we will definitely take a look at that, but I
Yeah.
think we're saying the same thing here.
we'll
So,
make sure
thank
that
you.
yeah, and I appreciate that. We'll take a deep dive into that and try to figure out if there's any disconnect there. But our intention is to say that if you submit an application that is eventually found to be complete and you submit it before the rule takes effect, then it's your legacy from those standards. That's our intention. So we can, if we need to clarify the rule on adoption to say that, we can do it.
yeah, because if that's the way it's running, then everybody's going to submit them on June 30th. And then we get comments from Andre or Todd or whatever about stormwater. And then eventually they're technically complete, but it was received before. Like, that's great with us. Like, we're okay with that. But
No, let me explain that a little better then. So let's say it comes in on June 30th. And let's say that the review officer looks at it and says, you didn't submit water quality calculations. You need to submit water quality calculations because this triggers water quality. Then that didn't show up as a technically complete application. We didn't know that until 2 weeks later when we took a look at it. So that means you would, in that case there, that wouldn't be legacy because it was found to be technically incomplete.
Right.
After the date.
So no incomplete placeholders is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think we need a flow chart. It might be something that we could.
That's a great idea, Vince.
Put it on our website. Yeah.
All right, we've got
Good
Grant.
question,
I see your hand. I'm going to go to Stephanie, and then I'll go to you, and then we'll go to Mike, and we'll sort of weave in the hands that way. Stephanie?
My question is simply, which plants are going to be considered invasive?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
She asked which plants are going to be considered invasive.
Well, that's something that we've deal with already today, right? You know, for wetlands mitigation plans, restoration of riparian zones, you need to place native non-invasive vegetation. So we have guidance that we provide as to the types of vegetation. And there's other agencies that can do as well.
All right, Grant, I think you're up.
Thanks, and sorry for not putting it in the chat. It was timely, so I wanted to raise my hand. In regard to the legacy provisions, what is the legacy provision for projects that did not previously require a DEP approval, for instance, on the reconstructed impervious surface? Because you wouldn't be submitting an application to be deemed complete if you weren't covered previously.
Grant, I'm not sure I follow what you mean. Can you give me an example?
You wouldn't have been covered by the stormwater rule currently, but under the new rules, you would be covered. Well,
okay.
The local application need to be received, deemed complete? I don't know if I might have missed that in the rule.
Yeah, so there's two triggers. One is that if you need a DEP permit and you apply for that DEP permit and it's a technically complete application, then you're legacy from the new standards. If you don't need a DEP permit and you have a local approval that's required, which most projects would, unless you're a state agency or something like that, then the rule, there's existing language in the rule that we've maintained about the types of approvals that would legacy you. And so as long as you apply before the adoption date, then it would be the same as if you applied to the department.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Anthony. I apologize. You had your hand up before Grant and I missed it. So we'll go to you, and then Mike, if you'll bear with us, you can go next. And I'm actually going to hand the emceeing to Gabe because sadly I have to leave you all. But thanks, and it is great being here with you while I could.
Thanks, Katie. All right, so who did Katie say was next?
Anthony Castillo.
Oh, Tony.
Vince, how are you? Thank you so much for once again presenting on this topic. So I want to get some clarification on the proposed rule change that's requiring for smaller storm infiltration. All right. In this case, I guess the proposal to infiltrate the 1.25 inch storm event. Right. So I wanted to bring up I know that in New York State, this is something that's done under the they call it runoff reduction. In New York, when you're presented with these types of projects, you are required to, at a minimum, provide some sort of what they call runoff reduction for these small, what they call the 90% event, analogous to the water quality event in New Jersey. What I wanted to see is if the department would consider, as they finally flesh out this rule proposal, the technical manual. What New York does is they come up with a minimum water quality volume requirement that you're supposed to capture and infiltrate or evapotranspirate and so forth. But they give you a minimum based on the underlying soil type. All right. And I believe it's and that gets reduced as you go from B down through D. What I would request is that as the department fleshes this out in the manuals, that there be some consideration to account for underlying soil type in calculating this requirement, just so that we make sure that we don't put too much water into the ground where the ground may not be able to handle it, and some of that water may not be able to get in there today for those small storms. So just requesting that be considered as part of the next generation of the design manual. That's all.
Vince, you want me to address that one?
Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
So first, I mean, we can't exactly do what you're suggesting because that's not what the rule language says, right? We can't alter what the rule requirement is based on the BMP manual. But the rule does require the water quality design storm volume. So that's the target for everyone across the board, regardless of what the soil conditions are. However, there is language in there that allows flexibility if you can't do infiltration. Like if you cannot make it happen on site, then the rules do allow an alternate scenario where you provide essentially detention of that storm instead of providing for permanent on-site retention. So you just have to detain it down to match the peak of what it would be on the site, hypothetically, if it was hydrologic soil group D woods. So as long as you can get it at or below that peak, then it'll meet the standard.
And then, of course, there's the other options too, Tony, for removing pavement and and other things.
Right.
Okay. Thank you much.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so then next question we're going to go to is Mike Pizarro. Mike, go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, Vince, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the redevelopment standard, but I was kind of curious. You talked about the redevelopment standard applying for water quality treatment, but I didn't hear anything about quantity reductions or the new on-site retention or volumetric reduction requirements applying to redevelopment sites as well. So could you clarify?
Sure. You want me to field that one too, Vince?
Sure.
All right.
Thank you.
So specifically, the peak rate reductions aren't going to apply necessarily. I mean, they already do apply to redevelopment sites, but if you don't increase impervious surface, you sort of meet that standard already. But the volume reduction is going to apply across the board. So you're going to have to address that if it's redevelopment. If you're a major development, you have to address that. So if that's right now a scenario where you are just redoing existing impervious surface, you wouldn't trigger water quality. Basically, you do quantity applies, but you don't have to do anything. Recharge applies, but you don't have to do anything. That's going to change because you're going to have to do the quality standard now. And then you would also have to do the on-site retention or the volume reduction standard. So you're going to have to put in some sort of BMPs to address both of those.
But the peak rates will stay the same.
Yeah, we're not altering that requirement.
Okay. Right.
But it is under the same category. Like this, the volume reduction standard is being added as an additional quantity control requirement.
Right.
Great. Thank you.
And having that volumetric reduction might reduce, it's certainly going to reduce the volume because that's the whole point of it, but it could reduce some of the peak flow rate too for some of the larger storms. It depends.
All right, I'm just going to alternate back between questions in the chat and hands raised. So the only other hand raised I see right now is from Lou Mastriani. So Lou, you can go ahead and ask your question.
You guys hear me? Can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Just kind of piggybacking on that last comment, where you might have a redeveloped site where maybe, you know, if you're just swapping out pavement or something, you know, we would meet the quantity by probably just curve under curve. If you're now required to do this volume reduction, is that going to have to be considered in possibly like altering that runoff hydrograph in your proposed conditions where it might push you out of that curve under curve scenario?
Right. So we also added some additional language to specifically address that point, where if the only reason you're no longer able to do what you're describing, where you stay under the existing hydrograph, is because of the volume reduction standard, then you still qualify.
Okay, perfect.
All right, so then next I'll
Thank
go
you.
to the next question. Yep, you're welcome. I'll go to the next question in the chat. So this is from an unknown user. You can go ahead and identify yourself. You can ask your question about bridge deck superstructures.
Valerie Rabel. That was, I gotta find it in the chat now. Bridge deck superstructures. Are they considered reconstructed for water quality, even though you said something about it, things being reconstructed, even though they're less than a quarter acre?
Bridge deck overlays would not be counted as disturbance.
No, I said
but
bridge.
I know. I'm trying to think of all through all the permutations of it. Yeah, the replacements of bridge decks would count towards disturbance, so it would count towards major development.
Well, the bridge deck itself is not disturbing anything, but it is a motor vehicle surface.
Right. So you're reconstructing a motor vehicle surface, and that's what the trigger would be.
Right, but in the chat, you asked if it was less than a quarter acre. So do keep in mind that the quarter acre is the threshold. So if it's less than a quarter acre, it's not going to be captured by these rules.
I thought you said presentation. I thought you said that it would be considered even if it was less than quarter acre. I mean, I haven't read all 1,000 pages.
Yeah,
but
to clarify, so both in the section that defines major development and in the water quality section, in both those cases, a quarter acre of reconstructed is required to either be considered a major development or to trigger the water quality section. Still requires the quarter acre.
Okay, so reconstructed, whether it's motor vehicle surface or whether it's regulated impervious, or only motor vehicle?
When it comes to the threshold of major development, it's both.
Both.
When it comes to the determination of whether or not water quality applies, it's only motor vehicle surface.
Okay, so there's really not that much of a change.
Right, just that it adds reconstruction in there. That's basically that section. If you look to the wording, all we did was add or reconstruction into that first part describing when it applies.
Right. So I guess the change would be like, let's say that you had a bridge deck or superstructure replacement that was a half an acre, right? Under today's rules, it's not disturbing an acre of land, and it's not constructing a quarter acre or more of motor vehicle surface or impervious surface, so it wouldn't trigger it. But under the proposed rules, it would, because it's more than a quarter of an acre of reconstructed area.
Okay, even though it's over water, it's not touching the ground, it's not actually creating any disturbance, and
right, because it's reconstruction in that. So there's the disturbance of an acre of land. That's one trigger, as you know, and then this other trigger is the quarter acre of construction or reconstruction of motor vehicle surface or impervious surface. So yeah, I guess if it's hanging over the water, it wouldn't be disturbance, but it would be reconstruction.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Val, for that question. Next, we'll go to Susan Bristol, who has her hand up.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you so much for dealing with redevelopment in this new way. I just wanted to put on my architect hat and suggest that reconstruction definition include additions to existing buildings, because every time there's an addition, there's certainly enough disturbance of the ground grade and runoff implications that would allow for some improvements to the site design. I just wondered if you thought that that might be included in the rule.
So I think the answer is basically that it just doesn't need to be added to the rule. That's already covered. If you add an addition to a building right now, that's new impervious, that's new disturbance. So that's already captured by the existing requirements in the rule.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Next question in the chat is from PWF. I'm not sure what that stands for, so please go ahead and unmute yourself and identify yourself and ask your question.
Hey, Gabe, that's me, Paul Ferrero. How are you? Vince, how are you?
Good. How you doing, Paul?
Okay. A couple of questions, and I want to try to just be as brief as possible, but I've got some concerns on how we deal with this reconstruction concept relative to parking lots and bridges on a local level. At what point does pothole repair in an existing degraded parking lot become enough reconstruction that water quality is required, and the offshoot of that will be a reduction in the size of the parking lot to put those GI elements in?
Well, fixing potholes would be covered under the definition of disturbance, and doing repair to pavement would not, no matter how much you were doing, would not constitute disturbance. And so if it doesn't constitute disturbance, it's not gonna trigger the major development.
Well, that seems contrary to what Gabe said about, when you get down through the pavement. That's in order to repair pavement, you get broken up asphalt, and you have to take it all the way down and get rid of all the pavement, because you get alligator cracking from the failed subbase. And that's very widespread in a lot of older parking lots. That is a problem that I don't know how we're going to manage, because in most cases, permits are not required to repave parking lots on a local level. So they're going to be redone, and we're not going to know about it. I'm putting my municipal engineer's hat on. How do we do that? How do these people know they have to do a, 5-figure redesign of their parking lot just because they want to fix the poor condition of the parking lot?
Yeah, there's no intention in this rulemaking to do things like that. We tried to make a distinction between, maintenance and repair activities where there isn't any opportunity to provide value. It's just keeping things in functioning condition, and so that would fall under that. So maybe that's something that can be clarified in our BMP manual or something like that.
That's got to be clarified with the reconstruction definition and those sorts of things. And the same thing goes to the bridge deck discussion that was just had, because I now drive across these bridge decks through Patterson that are not over water, that are part of a 10-year renewal project by the DOT. And I don't know how they're going to put trees on top of this bridge deck and do their green infrastructure there. It simply is not going to work. And yes, they might have waivers and those kinds of things that they can get, but I think there needs to be some consideration of that. And then I had two other comments. The first is, Gabe, you said that in response to Anthony's earlier comment relative to the DOT or the New York standard about the runoff and changing things in the BMP manual. I'm not sure that the change in the BMP manual would be a change from the rule, unless you're saying that you can't change the rule, which would mean that the comments are irrelevant. So I think Anthony's comment is in the context of a comment on the rule and needs to be taken that way, as opposed to necessarily implementing something in the BMP manual, because I know that comments can be made on the rules and the rules may change as they go along. And my last comment is this: the DEP has its rules for septic systems, 7:9A. They are set up as a delegation to the local authorities on septic systems. Is there a way that the department could have the overarching stormwater rule, so when developers, property owners look at the municipal engineers like we have 5 heads, when we ask them to do these things, we can say, well, go get a permit from the DEP, because under the septic code, you'd have to go get a treatment works approval. Is there any provision where we can refer them to the DEP? Because, these are battles we fight every day.
All right, so a couple of things to say there. So first, yeah, remarking back on what Anthony said earlier, of course, we accept comments on the rules once the proposals actually appears in the register, we'll accept comments. I interpreted him as saying, can we do that in the BMP manual, which is why I responded that way, that we can't actually change what the rule says in the BMP manual, but certainly we can accept comments on what the rule actually is proposing. And then the second question, now I forget. What was it again, Paul?
Well, it was a question about, just on a practical basis of how we deal with this on a municipal level, because,
right.
You're giving us full authority on these things, and there is no appeal. There is no anybody else for the property owners, developers, or anybody to talk to besides us when you don't need a state permit.
Yeah. So we're here to support you in those situations, but in reality, the final decision is yours. Now we have oversight through the MS4 program. So if the municipalities are doing something that doesn't meet the rules, we do have oversight in that way, but the final decision is made by the municipality. Now, many times in these tricky scenarios, they come to me and they ask, what should we do here? How do we make sure we're staying in compliance? And I'll give them that advice, but I can't actually make the decisions for them in that case. And I'm not sure that we could switch over to having a more septic rule like setup because of the way the laws are set up in New Jersey. Like the Stormwater Management Act sets forth that the municipalities need to adopt stormwater control ordinances and enforce them. So I think it would require potentially, and I'm no lawyer anyway, I think potentially though would require legislation to make that kind of change.
Paul, you're suggesting that folks, if you trigger major development, that you would just get a DEP permit?
No, I'm saying that
like a treatment works approval.
Oh, okay.
On the local level, if somebody doesn't comply with the local on the septic code, somebody doesn't comply with 7:9A, which is effectively the local ordinance, then they can make an application to the department for a TWA.
Right.
And that's where we're stuck
make it like
on the
that.
municipal. Yeah, we're stuck at the municipal level trying to enforce these ordinances and yeah, the DEP oversight, but when there is a problem, it is the municipality that has violated the rules and not the developer and not the property owner.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And I don't believe there's anything you can do about it. It's just more of a rhetorical question and a frustration.
Yeah. The one quick
point. Well, I think we should move on though to try to make sure we get to everyone else's questions.
I'm sorry,
but thanks for that comment, Paul.
Gabe, let me just add one thing if I could, not to that, but to the early thing about, because I think this question comes up a lot is, and we kind of hear this a lot, like if you can't change anything on adoption, why collecting comments, right? And so there's a few things. When we propose a rulemaking, we set out the reasons why we're doing what we're doing and the justifications for it. And so the comments are really valuable to us. We have to respond to every one of them. And sometimes the comments are outside the scope, like saying somebody might say, well, you should also change this other thing here. And our response could be, well, that's not part of this rulemaking, but we'll consider it in the future. It could be asking for clarification. What did you mean when you said this in the proposal? And that's something we definitely can do on adoption, is to clarify our intention. What we can't do on adoption is change substantive standards. So in other words, if we're saying that like on the proposal, it's the water quality design storm that needs to be retained and infiltrated on the site, we couldn't change that on adoption to the 2-year storm or something. Even if we got lots of great comments that made us think, yeah, that would be a great idea, we wouldn't be able to do that because it goes beyond the proposal, what the proposal covers. So there is a limit at what we can do on adoption, but I would encourage everyone to really thoughtfully review the rules and submit those comments, because we need them to make the rules best as it can be.
All right, thanks, Vince. We'll just go on to the next comment now. Brian Friedlich has this in the chat. Brian, can you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yep. Hi, Gabe and Vince. Can you
Brian.
explain what additional measures would need to be incorporated for TMDL areas? Will NJDEP enforce numerical percent reductions for pollutants other than TSS? So you get an application in that's in a TMDL area. What do you guys do?
So we're not going to be directly implementing the percent reductions that are in the TMDLs through what it says in here, unless that's specifically in the TMDL's implementation plan as an additional measure that like all stormwater BMPs used in this TMDL area need to remove 40% nitrogen. If that was in the TMDL and it said that, then it would get implemented through these rules and we would have to implement that at the state level and it would get implemented at the local level. But unless the TMDL makes that kind of specified targeted action that needs to be done, then no, generically, just implementation of the percent reductions that are in the TMDL, no.
Okay, so if there's a target percent reduction for, let's say, residential development in a table, you're not going to apply that as a required percent reduction for a stormwater BMP.
Right, not unless it's specifically identified in there as an additional measure, which is a regulatory term in the NJPACT rules.
Okay, thanks. And then I had one other follow-up question, which was for the retention standard. It says runoff generated by development. Is that for impervious areas or for all disturbed areas on a development?
I think it would cover all the disturbed area in the development.
Okay. Yeah, I would just note there's often areas around the fringe of a development that's very hard to retain, let's say, you know, unless you had like a drainage system that went around the entire perimeter.
Right. Well, you wouldn't necessarily actually need to capture that exact water. It's a volume standard. So if you just capture additional volume from the other area that you didn't capture, you can still get to that total water quality design storm volume.
Right, because it's volumetric, Brian. So you would just figure out the volume of the runoff from the entire site under the water quality design storm, and then you would just retain that volume. It wouldn't have to be the actual water that's running off of the area.
But it'd have to be an equivalent amount
Right.
of water as what's generated by that entire disturbed area, not just the impervious area.
That's right. That's correct.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Brian. All right, next question in the chat from Jared Thomas. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I think the answer is going to be like these can't be resolved as part of this rulemaking, but I just kind of want to summarize a few different concerns. One is I was curious. I know there's like a loophole within RSIS about the minimum time of concentration being set to 10 minutes within RSIS, and that my understanding is for residential projects overwrites the requirement that there is no minimum TC in 7:8. Is that still the case, or is there any rulemaking currently in the process to close that loophole?
Well, the RSIS is maintained by DCA, not by the department, so this rulemaking doesn't affect their rules at all. There have been ongoing discussions by DCA at their group that covers the RSIS, and there is a plan to amend those rules at some point, but it hasn't been proposed yet, so I don't know the exact details of what it'll contain.
Okay. Another question I had was, I know that we had the exemption for the temporary disturbed areas being exempt from like recharge and other things. When calculating stormwater runoff from those temporary disturbed areas in the proposed condition, right now we would treat them as being fair condition. Would that change? Is the intent to change that to becoming good for runoff calculation purposes?
Well, I think that our guidance requires all conditions to be counted as good.
Well, it's required as good for the existing condition, but then if you have a disturbed area in the proposed condition, you treat it as fair for the purposes of calculating runoff, which usually results in the proposed condition having a higher runoff rate. And what I'm asking is, would we change that to be good? Therefore, you know, if you had 1 CFS coming off from an area in the existing condition, you would still have 1 CFS in your proposed condition.
Well, none of this rulemaking directly affects what our guidance says on how you determine the calculations. Although I don't think our guidance tells you to use fair, but maybe I'm wrong.
It does in Chapter 5 of the BMP manual, I believe.
Okay, but I think that's a little project specific for the group right here. So let's just move on to the next question. Susan Bristol. Okay, so that's the same question you asked already. Dave Doman, you're up next.
I'll have to, I'll just submit my comments in the writing. I got to jump off for another meeting right now.
Okay, all right,
Sorry about
great.
that. Yep.
No problem.
Thank you.
And next up is Brandon Kelly.
Hey, Gabe, Brandon here. Yeah, if I recall that slide correctly, we were saying like reconstruction of sidewalk and curb wouldn't count towards the disturbance threshold of towards the quarter acre. Is that correct?
Well,
far
let
as-
me.
As far as like reconstruction of it, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, so milling, repaving, resurfacing pavement, patching broken pavement, sealing or filling roadway cracks or joints, repairing damaged concrete pavement joints, driveway repair, bridge or pipe / culvert patching, and bridge deck overlays. Repair replacement of median barriers, sidewalks, including installation of ramps pursuant to the Americans with Disabilities Act on existing impervious surface, curbs, inlets, manholes, catch basins. So basically, pretty much anything you could think of, like little components that are necessary to keep a roadway safe and operating, you could replace those things or maintain those things, and it would probably be covered under likely be covered under the definition of just of not meaning not being disturbance for the purpose of this rule.
Got it. So yeah, my question to that relates to generally if we have to replace or repair curb, we have to do like a full depth repair strip just in front of the curb and the roadway, say 2 feet. Would that be bundled into the curb disturbance and we wouldn't count that, or we'd have to, count that repair strip towards disturbance?
If it's necessary for the repair replacement of the curb, and since curbs are listed, then I would say it's fine. Then it wouldn't. It's not a disturbance that would trigger this rule.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, we run into this a lot on our like safe routes to school projects and that sort of thing, where we're fixing sidewalks and repairing curbs.
Right, and we don't want to slow that down in any way. So, and there's no opportunity to provide stormwater management and for something like that either. Like, what would you do? You'd have to put in a BMP just because of the curb replacement. That wouldn't make sense. So that's a good question though.
Awesome, thank you guys.
All right, thank you. And then next up, the next question is from another unknown user, so I'm not sure what your name is, so please identify yourself when you ask your question about permeable material.
Hey, yeah, just a quick question on the slides. Earlier on the slide, there were some exemption qualifiers where you mentioned permeable material several times, like for example, walkways or sidewalks. Is there any specific performance requirements for the like recharge or anything like that, or is it just any type of permeable material?
Really, it would be and it would really be any permeable material. So, stone, wood chips, coarse pavement, Gabe.
I can't. What section of the rule does it refer to?
I think he's referring to 5.2. Let me pull it up. I think he's referring to 5.2.
Yeah, I think it was some of your slides and earlier ones, some of the exempt activities, as long as it's solely of permeable material.
Yeah, it's in the existing rule at 5.2 G3.
Okay.
Yeah, so the existing rule says the construction of a public pedestrian access, such as a sidewalk or trail with a maximum width of 14 feet, provided that the access is made of permeable material. And all we did with that one was just clarify that it's not just construction, but it's also reconstruction or repair of those things. So generally, permeable material has meant, in the context of trails and things, as wood chips, stone, things like that. I don't know where we landed on porous pavement.
Yeah, I think we've landed on pervious paving being a BMP that needs to be designed appropriately in order to ensure that it's really considered permeable. Now, I'm not sure if we may have given out some flood hazard area permits by rules that included that as part of the activity, as long as we confirmed that they had done the permeable pavement correctly. But yeah, that's typically considered a BMP, and that's not really what the exemption there is about. It's for like wood chip trails or gravel trails.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's also referenced underneath the guide rail that it needs to be permeable under there for like the non-vegetated surface.
Right. Yeah,
I think that does allow them specifically to be pervious paving.
Yeah, it says so the installation of guide rail systems, provided that any pavement utilized consists solely of permeable material. So it says right there that it can be pavement under that context.
Okay. Next, a couple more from Dave Dillman, but he had to run. Next one I see is from Bill Fleming.
Hello. My question is, municipalities are now or will soon be amending their stormwater control ordinances in response to the IFP. Will these coastal zone modifications require similar ordinance amendments? And if so, are they just going to be for coastal communities, or is it going to be something you'll try to accomplish throughout the state?
So yes, municipalities will need to adopt new ordinances, most likely. I'll get back to that in a second. And no, it's not just going to apply to coastal communities, because things like the 5-foot sea level rise is only going to impact coastal communities, but that's not part of the stormwater rules. That's part of the flood hazard rules. So these changes to the stormwater rules affect the state. Every community in the state need to adopt revised ordinances. Now, under our last round of ordinances, we did give multiple versions of the model ordinance, one which references our rules much more than just repeating them. So if municipalities adopted the version that references our rules, they may not need to do another revision. I'll have to look back and see if it affected any of the stuff that's in there that they actually would have in their ordinance rather than being referenced. But if there's not any effect, then they could just keep their existing ordinance.
Okay, thanks.
Next is Brian Friedlich, but I think he asked that question. Ready?
I did. I asked that already. I had one other follow-up, if you don't
Okay,
mind. Would you consider making stormwater retrofit projects exempt? So, for example, let's say a municipality for a watershed improvement plan wants to do a parking lot rehab or like a porous pavement parking lot that can't quite meet the retention standards. I don't want the fact that they can't quite get there because of whatever conditions are out there prohibit them from completing the project because they can't meet the regulations.
Well, it's going to really depend on the scenario of whether or not the rules even apply, right? You have an existing parking lot, you want to do on-site retention.
Over a quarter acre,
Right.
So it would.
Yeah. But if you're adding a stormwater BMP there, that itself isn't going to trigger the rules. It's the reconstruction of the pavement or the disturbance that you're doing or something like that that's going to trigger the rules applicability.
So if it's a paved parking lot and we're changing it to be a pervious pavement parking lot, that would not trigger reconstructed impervious?
Well, I think in that case it would. Yeah, if you're going to completely change the parking lot over, it would.
Okay. So that's my point. If for projects that are trying to make things better, to not make them go all the way back to woods condition, or that's all.
Well, I think if you're converting your entire parking lot over, you should be able to at least get less runoff than the wooded area would, I think, in the water quality storm in terms of peak. You should be able to accomplish that. I mean, perhaps there are scenarios where you can't, but we do have, as Vince mentioned, a new section we added to the rules to allow for waivers where you can't meet things for any kind of project. So they could look to that one as well as a possible option.
Okay, thank you.
Dave, it's past 2:30. I know that we were trying to be respectful of everyone's time and limited to the time, but maybe we just want to do one or two more questions because I think this is very helpful to everyone. And then maybe go like another 5 minutes and then we'll close it.
And maybe I'll just try to answer some of them quickly so we can go a little faster. So the next one I see is, will the new retention requirements apply to redevelopment in a disturbed PA1 area? The answer to that is yes. Will apply everywhere. And Ryan Puma asked, how do you prove that the orifice that is smaller than 2.5 inches does not clog? We're going to introduce some examples in the BMP manual that people can use in those scenarios. And of course, you can always just have one that's 2.5 or larger, and that will be fine as well. One of the main ways we're going to look at doing it is by having an underdrain, perforated underdrain, basically, like right below the surface of the basin covered with stone. That way it can't really clog, and that'll be connected to your outlet control structure. Next, Mike Galen asked, can you please explain why the NJDP requires non-vegetated surface for guide rail installation? That's to make sure that there is not a significant increase in runoff coming from those projects, which is why we can give them an exemption basically from the rule.
And we don't require it. It's that public transportation entities want to do it. And we're saying that it's allowed in certain cases, but we're not saying that you.
And that gives them the exemption. If they can do it with non-pervious material, but then they have to address the rules.
Right.
Okay, Robert March asked a question about the 95% TSS removal. By tying to a pipe that laterals to the primary pipe tied to a head wall or seawater water, does that count as a direct discharge? I think the answer there is still yes.
Yeah.
Grant Lucking asked, can you expand on the definition of reconstruction, specifically what restoration applies to? Would, for instance, placing new roof that is a 1/4 acre or more trigger the rules? No, I don't think replacing your roof would trigger it.
No, that's a
It's an
maintenance
interesting
repair
question that we
activity.
didn't think about though. But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
just repair.
that falls into the same idea of repair and maintenance. So that maybe is something we can clarify.
The last one is from Lou Mastriani. Will the department define what would be considered impracticable conditions for the new requirement to retain the water quality design storm on site? I mean, we already have a definition of impracticability in the rule, which I think is what we probably try to use in those scenarios. But basically, it means you can't infiltrate, and you can, and you can put in a bioretention basin, but it can't capture the entire water quality design storm. So you're kind of stuck with no other really option. Oh, and then one more question just came in, so this will probably be our last one from Stephanie Williams. Is regulated impervious area definition going to clarify new stormwater conveyance system in the case of a pervious parking lot system previously talked about that would trigger major development? Well, there's no other changes to the definition there that would further clarify what a new stormwater conveyance system is. But basically, a new stormwater conveyance system is the construction of one where it didn't previously exist at all. So if that was a parking lot that had no stormwater conveyance system and you construct a pervious paving system there, I guess that would be the construction of a new conveyance system. But also if it's over an acre or over a 1/4 acre, that would trigger the rules anyway, because it's going to be disturbance and it's going to be reconstructed pervious or reconstructed motor vehicle surface.
Before we log off, I just wanted to point out that I noticed in the chat that Carl DuPont has posted a bunch of documents, and I wasn't sure if there was a question. I was looking through. Carl,
yeah, I didn't see any question associated with them. I think this is
Yeah.
just guidance for us to look at later.
Yeah, Carl, do you have any?
Wanna...
All right, well, it sounds like it's just for us to take a look at and read and consider. All right, well, with that, Gabe and I really appreciate all your time and attention to this. It's been, like Katie said, it's been a long road, and we're very excited about these changes. And so we look forward to your comments and your questions, and don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have thoughts or ideas, because we want this to be as clear and practical as possible. And with that, thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon.